There exists a Bible older than most Christian traditions, a text preserved in the mountains of Ethiopia for over 1,500 years. It contains 88 books. Most Bibles contain 66. The books it includes were removed from nearly every other canon in existence, not because they were proven false, but because they were considered too dangerous to remain. And the question no one seems to answer is this: what did these books contain that required their removal? The Ethiopian Bible is not a modern invention. It is not a revised edition or a sectarian interpretation. It is one of the oldest complete Christian canons in the world. Written in Ge'ez, an ancient language that predates most modern translations, this Bible has remained virtually unchanged since the 4th century. While councils convened in Rome, Constantinople, and Canterbury to determine which books belonged in Scripture, Ethiopia continued to use the texts they had always known. But here is what makes this remarkable. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never participated in those councils. They were geographically isolated, culturally independent, and theologically rooted in traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of Christianity. So when other churches began removing certain books from their canons, Ethiopia simply kept reading them. And today their Bible contains writings that most Christians have never encountered. So what is in this Bible, and why does it matter that these books were removed elsewhere? The Ethiopian Bible contains 88 books. Compare that to the Protestant Bible, which contains 66, or the Catholic Bible, which includes 73. The additional texts are not footnotes. They are complete books, histories, prophecies, apocalyptic writings, and among them are some of the most controversial texts in ancient Jewish and Christian literature. The most famous of these is the Book of Enoch, a detailed account of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth before the flood, took human wives, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. Enoch describes their names, their sins, and their ultimate punishment. It speaks of giants born from these unions, of a world so corrupted that God chose to reset it with water. And it provides a framework for understanding the spiritual forces at work in the pre-flood world. But Enoch is not alone. The Ethiopian canon also includes the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis. This text retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus with additional details not found in the Standard Bible. It divides history into Jubilee cycles. It explains angelic hierarchies. It describes the war in heaven, and it offers interpretations of law and covenant that differ from later rabbinic and Christian traditions. There is also the Book of Esdras, the Ascension of Isaiah, and several others. Each one adds layers of detail to biblical narratives. Each one was read and revered by early Christians, and each one was eventually deemed too problematic to include in the final canon. But why? What made these books so controversial that nearly every other Christian tradition chose to exclude them? The removal of these books did not happen all at once. It was a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. In the early church, there was no single agreed-upon list of scriptures. Different communities used different texts. Some churches read Enoch as authoritative. Others did not. Some included the Shepherd of Hermas. Others rejected it. The canon was fluid, debated, and regionally diverse. But as the church grew and institutionalized, councils were convened to settle the question. Which books were truly inspired? Which were useful but not authoritative? And which were dangerous? The criteria varied. Some books were excluded because their authorship was uncertain, others because they contradicted emerging theological positions, and some, like Enoch, were removed because they contained teachings that church leaders found difficult to control. Enoch, for example, describes the Watchers in explicit detail, It names them. It describes their rebellion. It connects them to the Nephilim and the corruption of the pre-flood world. But it also raises uncomfortable questions. If angels could sin, fall, and be imprisoned, what does that mean for the nature of free will? What does it mean for the spiritual hierarchy? And if these beings are still bound, awaiting judgment, what role do they play in the end times? These were not questions the early church wanted to encourage. So Enoch was gradually marginalized. By the 4th century, most Western churches had stopped reading it publicly. By the medieval period, it was considered apocryphal at best. And by the Reformation, it had been almost entirely forgotten in Europe. But not in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's relationship with Christianity is ancient. Tradition holds that the Ethiopian eunuch, baptized by Philip in the Book of Acts, returned home and spread the faith. By the 4th century, Christianity was the state religion, and the church that developed there was not shaped by Roman councils or European theology. It was shaped by African tradition, Jewish roots, and direct connections to the earliest Christian communities in Jerusalem and Egypt. Geographically, Ethiopia was isolated. Surrounded by deserts, mountains, and hostile empires, the Ethiopian church developed independently. They were not present at the Council of Nicaea. They did not participate in the debates over the canon at Carthage or Hippo. And when Jerome translated the Vulgate and excluded certain books, Ethiopia simply continued using the texts they had always used. This isolation became a form of preservation. While Europe debated, revised, and standardized, Ethiopia held firm. Their monks copied the same manuscripts their ancestors had copied. Their liturgies included the same readings, and their theology remained rooted in a tradition that predated the institutional changes sweeping through the Roman Church. So when other churches removed Enoch, Jubilees, and other texts, Ethiopia saw no reason to follow. These books were part of their heritage. They explained the spiritual world. They connected the Old Testament to the New, and they had been read in their churches for over 1,000 years. Why would they remove them now? But here is the question that lingers. Were these books actually dangerous, or were they simply inconvenient? The content of these books is not heretical in the traditional sense. They do not deny core Christian doctrines. They do not reject Christ. They do not promote false gods. What they do is expand the narrative. They add context to Genesis. They explain the origins of evil. They describe the spiritual realm in ways that most Christians never encounter. Take Enoch again. It describes the fall of the Watchers in detail. It names Azazel, Semyaza, and others. It explains how they taught humanity, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and weapons. It describes the Nephilim as hybrid beings, part human, part angelic, who became giants and corrupted the earth. And it reveals that these beings were not destroyed in the flood. They were imprisoned, bound in chains, awaiting a day of judgment. Sound familiar? It should. Because Revelation chapter 9 speaks of 4 angels bound at the Euphrates, prepared for a specific hour, day, month, and year. Peter and Jude both reference angels who sinned and were cast into chains of darkness. The New Testament assumes knowledge of these stories, but without Enoch, the references are incomplete. Fragments, hints at a larger narrative that most readers never see. This is why these books matter. They are not alternatives to Scripture. They are context. They fill in gaps. They explain references that otherwise seem obscure. And they reveal a cosmology, a spiritual architecture, that the early church understood, but later generations forgot. So were they banned because they were false, or because they revealed too much? Understanding the Ethiopian Bible changes how we read the rest of Scripture. If the watchers are real, if their rebellion is part of the larger story, then the spiritual warfare described in the New Testament is not metaphorical. It is historical, it is ongoing, and it connects directly to the prophecies of Revelation. This is why the story of Lucifer matters, why the angels imprisoned in the Euphrates matter, why the hidden history before Adam matters. These are not isolated mysteries. They are pieces of a larger narrative, a story that begins before Genesis 1:1 and culminates in the return of Christ. And the Ethiopian Bible preserves parts of that story that other traditions chose to leave out. But here is what most people miss. The removal of these books was not a conspiracy, it was a choice, a theological decision made by councils who believed they were protecting the faith. But in doing so, they also limited the scope of what believers could explore. They narrowed the canon, they standardized the narrative, and they ensured that questions about angels, watchers, Nephilim, and pre-flood history would remain unanswered in most Christian communities. Ethiopia refused to make that choice, and because they did, we still have access to these texts, not as curiosities, not as apocrypha, but as living scripture, read and revered by millions of Orthodox Christians who never doubted their authority. So here is the final revelation. The Ethiopian Bible was not banned everywhere, but the books it contains were, and the reason is not because they were false, it is because they were unsettling. They expanded the story beyond what institutional churches wanted to manage. They raised questions that were easier to avoid than answer, and they revealed a spiritual history that challenged simplified theologies. But truth does not disappear because it is uncomfortable. It waits. Preserved in ancient manuscripts, protected by isolated communities, and eventually, it resurfaces. Because the questions these books raise, questions about angels, rebellion, judgment, and the end times, are questions every generation must face, and the answers are still there, written in Ge'ez, bound in leather, sitting in the highlands of Ethiopia, waiting for anyone willing to read them. The Ethiopian Bible was not banned, but the world tried to forget it. And now, as we search for answers to the mysteries of Revelation, Enoch, and the Watchers, we find ourselves returning to the texts Ethiopia never abandoned. Because sometimes, the oldest stories hold the deepest truths. If this investigation opened new questions for you, you need to see what comes next. Our upcoming episode, The Watchers, the fallen angels that changed human history. We'll dive deeper into the beings Enoch described and the rebellion that fractured creation. You should also watch the Lost Dead Sea Scrolls, which reveals how these ancient texts were rediscovered and what they confirm about the early church's knowledge. And the story of Lucifer connects the first rebellion to everything that followed. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notification bell. Because the mysteries we are uncovering are not random. They are connected. And every episode brings us closer to understanding the full story. Leave a comment below. Do you think some books were removed for a reason? Or were they simply too challenging for institutional control? We want to hear your perspective. The next episode will reveal something that will change how you read Revelation. A prophecy hidden in plain sight. A warning most believers have never noticed. And a timeline that may already be unfolding. The veil is lifting. And the truth has been waiting in the oldest texts for those willing to find it.